There are kings remembered because they conquered great territories. There are kings remembered because they built great cities. And there are kings remembered because of the ideas they left behind. But Zera Yacob is different. He was a king who spent much of his youth as a prisoner, a ruler who became deeply involved in Christian theology, a king who traveled across Ethiopia in search of a sacred place for a cross, a ruler who fought wars, challenged religious practices, built Debre Berhan, and wrote theological works in Ge'ez. And he was also a king whose rule could become extremely severe. Perhaps the most difficult story of all is the story of what happened when one of his own sons was accused of abusing royal power. To understand that story, we first have to go back to the beginning. Zera Yacob was born around 1399 in a small village called Telk in the province of Fathagar. He was the youngest son of Emperor Dawit I. According to Ethiopian tradition, his mother had already lost her first child. During a difficult pregnancy, she prayed that this second son would survive. He did, and his survival was later remembered in the emperor's own writings as something remarkable. But surviving childhood did not mean surviving the politics of the royal family. When Emperor Dawit died, Zera Yacob's older brother Teodros became emperor. And the new emperor saw his younger brother not simply as family, but as a possible threat. So Zera Yacob was sent to Amba Geshen. Amba Geshen was the mountain prison where members of the royal family could be kept away from political life. Zera Yacob was still young, and he would remain there for roughly 20 years. For 2 decades, while other members of his family rose and fell from the throne, Zera Yacob lived in isolation. He did not govern a province. He did not command an army. He did not control the royal court. He was simply waiting. Then, after years of imprisonment, something extraordinary happened. One by one, the other possibilities disappeared, and Zera Yacob became the last man standing. In 1434, he became emperor of Ethiopia. The prisoner had become king. But the years on the mountain had already shaped the ruler he was about to become. There is another important Ethiopian tradition connected to the beginning of Zera Yacob's reign. It concerns a cross. According to the tradition, Zera Yacob's father died while returning from Egypt carrying a cross with him. Later, after Zera Yacob became king, he went to the place where his father had died. There he found the cross. He took it and continued his journey back into Ethiopia. But according to the tradition, God then revealed to Zera Yacob that the cross should be placed in a special location. He was to find a place whose shape resembled a cross. So the king began searching. He traveled through different parts of Ethiopia. Again and again he continued the search. Finally, his journey brought him to Gishen Debre Kerbe in Wollo. There, according to Ethiopian tradition, Zera Yacob found the place he had been looking for. The shape of the land matched the sign he had been searching for. And there he placed the cross. For Ethiopian tradition, this was more than a journey across the country. The cross was connected to his father. Zera Yacob carried it forward, and finally, after a long search, he believed he had found the place where it was meant to remain. This story also reveals something important about Zera Yacob. For him, religion and kingship were deeply connected. Zera Yacob was formally crowned in Aksum in 1436, 2 years after becoming emperor. Aksum was not simply another city. It represented the ancient roots of Ethiopian kingship and Christianity, and Zera Yacob wanted his reign to strengthen that Christian identity. He confronted practices he believed had no place in Christianity.
He acted against what he considered pagan survivals and religious practices that he believed were wrong. According to Ethiopian historical accounts, he used spies to discover people who continued to worship traditional deities. Those accused could face severe punishment. And the severity of his religious policy did not stop with ordinary people. Even members of his own family could become targets when he believed they were violating the faith he was trying to enforce. Zera Yacob also introduced visible signs of Christian identity. He ordered Christians to wear symbols and inscriptions expressing loyalty to the Trinity and rejection of the devil. For Zera Yacob, religion was not simply a private matter. It was part of the identity of the kingdom, and that belief would shape almost everything he did as emperor.
But not every religious problem was solved with punishment. For generations, Ethiopian Christianity had faced a serious disagreement over the Sabbath. One side emphasized Sunday, another insisted that Saturday should also be honored. Zera Yacob became deeply involved in the dispute. He worked to bring the two sides together. Eventually, an agreement was reached at a church council in 1450. This was important because it showed another side of the emperor. Zera Yacob could use force, but he could also negotiate when he believed negotiation could preserve unity. For him, a unified Christian kingdom was essential. But Ethiopia was surrounded by political and military challenges. To the south and east were Muslim sultanates, some of which had relationships with the Ethiopian crown. When the ruler of Halley refused to submit to Ethiopian authority, Zera Yacob moved against him. The conflict ended with the rebel ruler's death. Zera Yacob then moved against Halley when tribute stopped being paid. From this campaign came one of the important women of Ethiopian history, Eleni, a Halley princess who was baptized and became Zera Yacob's wife. She never bore him children of her own, but in the years after his death, Eleni would grow into one of the most powerful political figures Ethiopia had ever seen, guiding the empire through decades that followed his reign. The greater threat came from the east. The Sultanate of Adal became a serious rival to the Ethiopian kingdom. Tensions with Egypt made the danger worse. When Egyptian authorities in Cairo demolished a monastery connected to the Ethiopian church, Zera Yacob was furious. He ordered a period of national mourning across the kingdom, and he sent a sharp letter of protest to the Egyptian sultan. In that letter, Zera Yacob reminded the sultan that Ethiopia controlled the source of the Nile River and that he had the power to divert its waters. He said he had chosen not to out of concern for the suffering it would cause to the people of Egypt. It was both a warning and a statement of restraint. The sultan responded with gifts meant to calm the emperor's anger, but he refused to rebuild what had been destroyed. Soon after, the sultan encouraged the ruler of Adal to invade Ethiopian territory and distract Zera Yacob from the dispute. In 1445, Zera Yacob met Adal's forces at Comet. The Ethiopian army defeated them. The victory strengthened Ethiopian influence over the southern kingdoms, and the following year, Adal agreed to pay tribute. Zera Yacob also campaigned in the north and toward the Red Sea. His reign, therefore, was not only a religious reign, it was also a military expansion and defense.
Then, in 1456, something appeared in the Ethiopian sky. A brilliant light broke across the night over the highlands. Zera Yacob did not see it as an ordinary event. He understood it as a message from God. Only weeks earlier, he had ordered a group of accused heretics to be stoned to death. To him, the light in the sky was a divine confirmation. And from this experience came one of the most important cities of his reign, Debre Berhan. The name means mountain of light. Zera Yacob built a church there. He later established a royal palace and another church dedicated to Saint Cyriacus. Debre Berhan became his main seat of power for the rest of his reign. The city, therefore, became more than a political center. It became a symbol of Zera Yacob's religious vision of kingship.
But Zera Yacob was not content to look only inward. In 1441, he sent delegates all the way to the Council of Florence in Italy, opening a channel between the Ethiopian Church and the leaders of Western Christianity. European churchmen, confused by Ethiopian royal titles, insisted on calling him by a name out of European legend, Prester John, the mythical Christian king believed to rule somewhere in the East. Ethiopian delegates tried to explain that no such title existed in their own tradition. It made little difference. Europeans continued to imagine Zera Yacob as their long-lost Christian ally. Nearly a decade later, in 1450, he sent another mission to Europe, this time asking for skilled artisans to help build and strengthen his kingdom. The request eventually reached King Alfonso V of Aragon, who agreed to help. It was a rare moment of direct contact between a 15th-century Ethiopian court and the kingdoms of Western Europe, centuries before such connections became common. But there is another side of Zera Yacob that is easy to overlook. He was not only a king, he was also a writer and theologian. Zera Yacob was deeply involved in religious writing in Ge'ez. Among the works associated with him is the Mezhaf Berhan, the Book of Light. The work deals with Christian theology and religious teaching and reflects the emperor's ideas about the faith of his kingdom. Another work associated with him is the Mezhaf Milad, the Book of the Nativity. There is also the Mezhaf Selassie, the Book of the Trinity. Other religious works and homilies are also attributed to him. These writings matter because they allow us to see Zera Yacob not only through the actions of a king, but through the ideas of a thinker. He was concerned with Christian belief. He was concerned with religious education. He was concerned with the unity of the church, and he wanted those ideas to shape Ethiopian society. His writings, therefore, give us something extremely valuable, his own intellectual voice. We can see what he believed. We can see how he understood Christianity. And we can begin to understand why religion became so central to his government. Zera Yacob was not simply enforcing rules without thought. He had a theological vision, and that vision shaped his reign.
There is a story preserved in Ethiopian historical tradition about Zera Yacob and one of his sons. According to this account, Zera Yacob once traveled to Debre Libanos. Before leaving, he placed his son in his position, giving him authority to govern while the king was away. During the king's absence, a church deacon committed what the Ethiopian account describes as a relatively simple offense, but the prince punished him with death. The man was killed. When Zera Yacob returned, the matter came before him. His mother appealed to the king and asked him to judge what had happened. Zera Yacob examined the case carefully. He then called together the officials responsible for administering justice, and he asked them to judge his son. But they hesitated. The accused was not an ordinary man. He was the king's son. The officials did not want to impose the same punishment on a member of the royal family. That was when Zera Yacob became angry. According to the Ethiopian account, he told them that if they were unwilling to judge his son, then he himself would do it. And the king ordered the execution of his own son. But there is one detail in this story that makes it even more powerful. Zera Yacob ordered that his son be killed in the same place where the prince had ordered the deacon to be killed. The story, therefore, is not simply a king killed his son. According to the Ethiopian tradition, the issue was whether royal blood could stand above the law.
The prince had exercised the authority of the state against another person, and when the officials refused to judge the prince because he was a member of the royal family, Zera Yacob refused to give him that protection. Whether we agree with the punishment today is a different question. What matters for understanding the historical account is that the story presents Zera Yacob as a ruler who believed royal authority carried responsibility even for his own family. It is one of the darkest and most difficult stories associated with his reign, but it also reveals the extraordinary power of the Ethiopian monarchy and the severe meaning that justice could have under a 15th-century Christian king. Zera Yacob died in August 1468 at Debre Berhan. He had ruled Ethiopia for 34 years. His son, Bida Mariam, succeeded him. By the end of his life, Zera Yacob had transformed the kingdom in many ways. He had strengthened the Christian institutions of the empire. He had fought wars and expanded Ethiopian influence. He had built Debre Berhan. He had written theological works. He had established connections with Christian powers beyond Ethiopia. But he had also left behind a record of severe punishment, religious persecution, political suspicion, and violence within his own household. So who was Zera Yacob? A great king? A dangerous king? A religious reformer? A theologian? A warrior? A man shaped by 20 years of imprisonment? Perhaps the problem is that we want history to give us only one answer. Zera Yacob does not fit easily into one category. He was a deeply religious ruler who believed he was defending the faith. He was an intellectual who wrote theological works in Ge'ez. He was a king who built and strengthened institutions. He was a military ruler who defended and expanded Ethiopian power. But he was also capable of extraordinary severity. He punished people for what he considered religious crimes. He turned against members of his own family, and according to Ethiopian historical tradition, he ultimately ordered the execution of his own son, rather than allow royal privilege to stand above the judgment he believed was required. That is the difficult part of Zera Yacob's story. We do not have to make him a saint, and we do not have to reduce him to a tyrant. We can examine what the Ethiopian historical tradition tells us. We can read the writings connected to his reign. We can look at the churches and places associated with him. And we can ask what kind of world produced a king like Zera Yacob, because history is rarely as simple as good king or bad king. Zera Yacob was a man shaped by his time, a prisoner who became emperor, a believer who became a reformer, a writer who became a ruler, a king who demanded obedience, and according to the tradition of his own people, a father who was willing to judge his own son. His reign ended in 1468, but the questions surrounding his rule did not. And perhaps that is why Zera Yacob remains one of the most fascinating rulers in Ethiopian history, not because he was easy to understand, but because he was not.